Today we were talking art and faith with Salomon Ligthelm. He is someone I've tracked for a long time, inspiration of mine, done beautiful work. I think he started in the church. He was like a missionary kid, and then he's been all around the world, and I feel like you kind of see that in some of his work. Commercials for Apple, Puma, Adidas, music videos for like Bieber and Skrillex and The Weeknd, but the work itself is always just so beautiful from aesthetics, but also like the sound design so good. I chat some about that, and he's someone to for sure check out, but also just like talking about his faith. He's always been open about that and kind of the journey he's been on through that process, and it's just real encouragement and worth checking out. And we chat some about his short film Beyond the Endless Light that you should see, also beautiful. And yeah, so let's dive right in. I remember that when I first time of like seeing your stuff, I felt like there was like, oh, it's uniquely beautiful, but then like the sound, like I feel like it was one of the first times I was like, oh man, this is what sound and music can really do to like add so much to it. So yeah, I kind of always I'm like, oh, the best color correction is good music and sound design, and then color correction. So anyway, this is kind of a conversation I've had with friends too, about your work and stuff. So I appreciate you being on here and chatting with us. So.
Oh man, no, appreciate that. But I will say I agree. I mean, not necessarily about my own work, but sound for me is like, people say sound is 50%. I think sound is 80%. There's a lot that you can do on a black screen, and just sound design, like the opening of Zero Dark 30 is just that, and it just immerses you. It pulls you in. So for me, sound is very, very important.
Totally. I know I'm working on I just did a short film. We're in post-production, like kind of a psychological thriller. And, as you get rough cuts, you're like, we pretty much need to finalize sound even on our rough cuts. Otherwise, we don't really know what we're creating.
Exactly. The shape of things is not the same if you don't have sound. So that's why when I edit all my rough cuts, someone asked me the question recently on a thing that I just released, like, how much are you shaping this? The material, the edits in sound design, are fully shaping it in sound design.
Totally. Yeah. Speaking of which, I just saw, I got to watch your Beyond the Endless Light film.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one actually that I had a question about. Yeah.
So good. Yeah. It made me think of I think you reposted this too, but it made me just think of like, who was it was saying films should feel more like music than it does like fiction, it's more
Kubrick.
Movies. Yeah, Kubrick, that's right.
Yeah, Stanley Kubrick said it. And in some ways I really agree with that, because I think I've just been thinking and this is just the me thought. This has not been I'm not reading this from somewhere, so it could be completely wrong. But I think there's like a couple of things that are almost like transcendent languages, meaning they bypass rationality and they sort of go straight to the soul. They go straight to the heart. I think that's music. Like, you could have a really horrible day and put your defenses up, and music just hits past the defenses. They pass through rational, logical defenses, and they open you up to the divine. I mean, I want to say the divine, and think there's a couple of things: music, film, comedy, nature, and I can't remember what the other thing, like art does the same. Like those 5 things, and I'm sure there's more, but like they just cut through, through defenses, through rational ways of processing. And so for me, those are really, really powerful tools, that some of which I use and others that I'm just sort of recognizing.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard, especially in a sermon on art, which you don't hear a whole lot of, I feel like, at least I don't, but about art can awaken the imagination, and how there's pretty much no version of like believing in God or coming to believe the God without imagination. Like, you have to picture it, you have to see it, even though you don't see it. You know what I mean? You have to believe it, even though you don't see it.
Exactly. It's like, for me, it's like, you have to get to the end of reason. You have to get to the end of rationality. And it's not a trade-off between rationality. It's just these things exist. God exists sort of beyond our rationality. And because it's just so much bigger. There's just so much of reality that art or that science hasn't figured out yet. So I'm very much against sort of like materialist absolutism,
Yeah.
because I think it's just not a great way to explain how our reality works. I think reality is a mix between the known, so science and knowledge, and the unknown and faith. And so you have to have a level of belief, and with that doubt, but that's how you sort of navigate reality, I think, in the way that I think makes sense to me is sort of
Yeah.
logical.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's interesting. So I was going to say, so why I like the origin of this podcast and wanting to talk to creators who do great work, who I'd like have kind of stuff that's gutted me in the heart before, but also people that would say that like, the Lord has rescued them or is, it's their God. um, what I found was okay, I'm going to try to write, this is like last year. I'm like, I want to write this story, and I see how God speaks to people, and he's rescued me in these ways. And I've seen him show up in my life, even in like with community groups and with heartbreaks and these things. And so I'm like, I want to do my best to write with him or write on faith. And the first inclination, I think a very like Western thought is like, oh, so I should write a story that makes him shows off how good he is. Or I should, I know what I should tell people something about him and work backwards around the story, which I think is like the first way to make a terrible story, um,
Right.
to just try to essentially like reverse engineer a scripture or something.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
so I felt like I was hitting this dead end wall, and I was like, okay, that's very clearly like essentially that's just like propaganda,
mm,
like positive propaganda, but propaganda nonetheless. So I'm
mm,
like, well, let's delete all of this and start over. And what I felt like he was calling me to was like, just start typing like on faith, like no plan, nothing, and
mm,
almost like as an act of faith. And not that he's calling everybody to this, but I felt like that he was calling me to was like, just start typing on faith.
mm,
Um, and I was just like, oh, I would love to hear from more people about their experience, especially in the early phases. I mean, really lots of phases, but like as you're creating a story, do you feel like there's a version of like the Holy Spirit or God or somehow like being a part of that process? I so often feel like my creating process, I almost have to isolate everything and like
mm,
focus on this, and then I like touch base with God after. And I was like, I just love
mm.
to hear what your experience is like, with creating, especially in the idea phase.
When I started, it came from a very pure place, and then I was working for a church, and then I moved to the US, and I was wanting to get into commercials because I felt like I just wanted to learn a little bit better how to work with bigger teams, how to upskill my craft. But I came to America 2014, 2015, 2016, when I think there was a real aversion building to things of faith. And even there was a massive move, like a deconstructionist movement, some people figuring out their faith and what it looked like. And so many of my friends actually I don't know what to say, walking away, but maybe moving away from the traditional way that the Western faith expression had been seen.
Yeah.
And so I was sort of like, where I was creating purely before, now I was sort of really tempering um, the way that I was sort of talking or including my faith in the process. I was very conscious of that I didn't want to feel like I was proselytizing to something that a lot of people were feeling hostile towards in a way.
Yeah.
Um, and so I was like, okay, I'm not going to put that in really any of my work. Um, what ended up happening is I started looking at the work and I see that the stuff was just bleeding out of me. I couldn't even switch it off because it's just such a fundamental part of who I am. My parents are missionaries. I grew up, as a missionary kid, sort of across the world, across a bunch of spaces. And I think I had I want to say I had a rock bottom in 2018, which was just through burnout. It was like working too much, and sort of putting so much stake in the things that I was doing, um, uh, that I was going really hard, and I sort of felt myself, my inner man, atrophying. Just my relationship as a son to my mom and dad, my relationship as a brother to my sister, my relationship as a husband to my wife. Um, I think maybe in some ways, I think they didn't see anything different, but I knew that I was sort of like grinding hard on the career path, and I burned out, and nothing could get me out of it. And I remember for 3 months, I was like going to bed at 7 p.m. and sleeping till 10 a.m. I was like, it didn't feel healthy, but that was my way to sort of just cope with reality. And I sort of it was a music video, and the feedback on the music video that never got released, but from the management, that tripped me up. But my mom said something to me, and she said, I just want you to know that you are beloved. And she said it in like the deepest sense. Like, she said it in the sense that a mom would say to her son because she loves him, but also that sort of a fallible way, because, she doesn't have perfect love, but she meant it in a perfect sense, like in a cosmic sense. You are loved eternally, by God. And I remember that was the thing. Like, it was like my cup was empty, and in that moment, my cup filled, and
Wow.
I realized that, like, our identity, and this is why I don't want to sound dogmatic, but certainly as I sort of experienced it, like, God fills that identity cup when we feel absolutely worthless, like we have nothing to offer our family or our friends. Like, God restores that. And it's not I think our identity gets depleted when our ego burns really hard. And it's such a fake version of worth, our ego sort of posturing. But then, it takes one little small thing for the ego to crumble, for the ego to break. And then you realize, oh, there was nothing there to begin with. Or I built on like bad foundations. And then the thing that really restores you, for me, certainly, has been like knowing who I am in Christ, knowing that I'm made in his image and I'm like infinitely loved. That made me come back to the table with my family and be a better husband and father. And to sort of tie this back into what we're talking about, that became a vital thing for me. It just became like, that's not something that I want to hide, because actually that's what made me a restored person, a restored husband, dad, father, human. Imperfectly, sure, I'm still imperfect as all of those things, but at least my ability to feel like I have something to offer back to my family, that was brought back. And so where I sort of like hid, where I was sort of hiding to the outside world and to the industry, not I don't want to say like obviously, but it's just something that I wanted to talk about or put out. I'm like now not so scared about, because actually it bleeds into my work, and it's vital to me. It is me. It's a part of me. It's part of what sort of has restored my identity and keeps doing it. And now I feel like actually there's some stuff that I want to explore that's like really dealing with that, that isn't necessarily, like you said, it's not like, oh, how do I reverse engineer this message? But there are things that I can see in films that really speak to me, Tarkovsky films, or even Sound of Metal, where dealing with identity and who you are sort of up against who God is something that like I'm really drawn to, and I really want to talk about, but I want to do it in really complex ways, and I want to be truly authentic to that expression. So that might mean I make an R-rated film or whatever. I sort of don't care about the perception of what the wrapper is, what the thing is wrapped in. as long as at the end of it there is some sort of truth to it, that's like, for instance, I'm working on a feature film about a missionary kid who has a really bad, rebellious drug addiction problem. Like, he's rebellious, and that sort of spirals out of control and moves to Russia with his family, with his mom and dad. His father is taken by state authorities, and when his mother delves more deeply into her persecuted Christian community, he sort of digs more deeply into his drug addiction. And it's really raw, it's really honest, and it's really broken and swearing. But I want it to be truthful, and I sort of want that journey of him having to wrestle with his faith to also be truthful. I haven't seen that. I have not seen that in film. I have not, never, even in Passion of the Christ or things that are sort of considered as artistic works. I've never seen truly, really raw, honest films exploring that. And I think recently, or since that burnout that I've had in 2018, so over the last 6-7 years, I've been thinking, actually, that's what I want to do with my work. I want to just create very honestly about the tensions of living in this world and how messed up and how broken that is, and also what I found in who God is. So yeah, I'm not very intentional, I should say, about every time I sit down, oh, am I going to include or exclude God in this process? I think he's in everything that I do. It's there's no boundaries, there's no limits, there's no separation in process. It's what I think about, it's who I think about often. And I don't know if that answers the question, and it's a long-winded answer.
No, absolutely. No, I think you're tapping in exactly what I'm wanting to chat about, which is like, I think, but this is a theory, poke some holes in it if you can, or, whatever. But I feel like my experience with creating and my experience with like the Holy Spirit, it's almost, this could be blasphemy, I don't know, but it's almost like it's the same language in a way. I feel like that there's this prompting, the same thing with music that you feel is the same thing sometimes I feel like I felt with the Holy Spirit. And I think that to try to like make a useful idea and to try to like be all left brain on it, and I think it almost like I almost feel like you can actually box God out of the creating process if you're not careful. And I think when you actually follow that feeling, and I'm not sure that's true for everybody, but I think if you're really seeking the Lord, he says you'll find him, and I feel like if you bring that, like, it's just as in your life, you're just seeking the Lord, and then you go into that artistic process where you're like using this, where does my, like, heart might be the wrong word, but I'm going to say spirit, like, lead me in this, like, what grips my heart. I feel like what I find is what you're saying is it kind of just bleeds into the process. Like, even on this, I started writing this short on healing in a way, on like therapy, mental health and healing. And I was like, okay, I wrote this draft 2, God. I'm like, there's nothing in here for you. Like, I mean, it's meaningful and I love it, but I don't see how this would bring you glory per se. Is that what we're doing? Is that okay? And I felt like he's like, yeah. He's like, just keep moving forward in the process. And as even I get notes from my collaborators and stuff, like slowly over time, I'm like, as I'm looking at the edit, I'm like, oh, like I see the Lord all over this, and not that everybody will. But I think there's something about like that urge that, especially for a believer seeking the Lord, that like pursue it and invite the Lord into it. But like, I think it just spills in. At least that's kind of been my experience. And I feel like that's kind of what you're saying similarly too. Does that connect or relate at all for you?
Yeah, definitely. I think I do agree. I do agree with that. I think, and I'll just use an example. I think I'm really interested in a bunch of different genres and a bunch of different stories, that explore different themes, often sort of intersecting. I don't think God has sort of designated the role of the artist to make, without sort of disparaging them necessarily, or not at all, just to make Angel Studio sort of work, or films. I think,
Mm-hmm.
um, I think the artist being an artist, for one, is sort of a glorifying thing. But I'm not going to speak as a theologian. It's not, not my place to sort of define the boundaries. But I do think, like you said, it's like, I think God will work through. I mean, man, he speaks to me through secular music and through a lot of different avenues that I just wasn't expecting, for him to sort of speak to me through. And I've got mythological stories that I want to tell that thematically deals with materialism. But I think sometimes when you just see like it's got gargoyles in it, and I think a lot of Christians would say, "Oh, well, that's demonic." Like this new thing that I just did, or it comes out for Little Sims soon. I think a lot of people could go, "Oh, that looks very scary." But it's a mythology story that sort of like deals with people valuing materialism and how that can really bring you to ruin. And in some ways, I think there's sort of a message at the heart of that I think is sort of deeply anti. How can I say it? In some ways, I don't want to say that the work that I'm making in that front is godly, but I think the message of do not be consumed by the things of this world is at the heart of it. And even though the exterior wrapper of it, which I think a lot of Christians have a lot of issues with the way things look, and they can't even see the deeper meaning that is buried underneath it. And I think I don't really care now so much about how things look, because I'm really after about the deeper meaning, and sometimes even using the language that a culture understands to sort of subvert it and to critique it is also really important for me. So, yeah.
Yeah, I know Flannery O'Connor, she would write, she's a theologian and would write horror stories. And I know she would say, as a critique, she'd be like, "Oh, I could write a paper or a story about a pile of garbage, and people would say, 'Oh, you're glorifying garbage.'"
Right.
And she's like, "The logic's not there at all,
Exactly.
But it's like, it's not being glorified just because it's mentioned, or because it's brought into the room."
Exactly. And Tolkien did that, and C.S. Lewis did that to some extent. I don't see that happening these days so much anymore, but that's certainly where I'm sort of trying to explore. But even I think now in a more modern contemporary lens, I don't necessarily know what that looks like, but I think there's stories that I think that hasn't been told, certainly hasn't been told, because I think because having grown up in Protestant evangelical Christianity, and so that's so much of America, that version of Christianity has put so many shame boxes around what people can and can't explore and do, that I think it's sort of become a very institutionalized thing. Is I don't even think it's the heart of the gospel at all. Some of these strictures that I think the Pentecostal Protestant evangelical movement has sort of put on art and artists. I think even for the longest time, the church has sort of usurped all the artists and sort of like employed them. Okay, great. But then those artists become used to only creating sort of within that space. And when they leave the church, sometimes they go and rebel. And I just want to do something that is
absolutely
out of these strictures. And I
think you see it in music as well. I think often I feel like film sort of follows music in some ways. And I feel like so many musicians, especially coming from the church, some of my close friends, worship leaders, I feel like sometimes I'm like, oh, the best way to create an atheist artist is to force them to only play and pretend to worship in front of thousands of people over and over again. No matter how they're feeling or what they're going through, or
there's sort of have to. It just becomes a business. It just becomes, and that's the thing. I think we've lost the wonder. I mean, it's a cliche, but I think we have lost the wonder. It's like when it becomes too corporate, when it becomes too business-like, when there's too much money in it, I think it's really hard for artists to stay pure in it, you know.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm trying to protect that sort of uh in my own spirit, you know. And I sort of left the church not making stuff in that domain, but I don't want to. There's still so. I mean, it's at the heart of everything I want to explore. Is and you know the big thing that I've never seen comedy really, like comedy done in that space. I often ask, uh, and sort of my wrestling and communion with God is like, if that's such a big part of the human experience, why don't we see more of it sort of in the scriptures? Why don't we see more of it sort of in the Christian faith? And it is actually in the Orthodox tradition. There's the character of the holy fool, or the role of the holy fool, and to sort of poke fun at the system, the dogma and the strictures within dogmatic systems. And it's something I really want to play with and explore, because I also want to poke fun at like where faith in Christianity, especially when it turns dogmatic and fundamentalistic and ignorant, um, I want to sort of like poke at that to sort of point to what is true.
Yeah.
And that's something that I feel really sort of energized by recently,
Yeah.
because I think a lot of time when people sort of think about Christianity in art, it's um it's either sort of really saccharine and sappy, or it's always so moving and so deep, and sort of I get that. But there is another
Yeah.
dimension to it that I think is worth exploring that just again I haven't seen. You know, like there's two stories that I'm exploring now that sort of like really farcical, but it also gets to the heart of it. But it's not just doing it through that one lens. It's sort of like painting a picture using the full spectrum of human emotions to get to something that feels true and isn't
Yeah.
neatly tied up. There's still answers and questions at the end that I think is sort of the most interesting thing about cinema and stories is when you can have a non-didactic ending, or not strong sort of plot mechanical ending, but it's deeply emotional and felt and true and satisfying in that way.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Can you tell me about, so yeah, I'm interested in that. So like something that going into the farcical comedy side, like what would be, again, ultra practical, like what would be
An example of that?
the reference? Yeah, like maybe it's not with the faith side, but as far as like tonally on the comedy side, like if you're like, oh, The Office, but at church, or like,
Oh,
like, or
okay.
what is,
Here's two ideas. One is of an Orthodox priest who baptizes his congregation like one winter's morning on an icy lake. Um, and he ends up baptizing this beautiful woman and gets a boner, and sort of sees that as a sign that maybe this life of voluntary celibacy that I've led, maybe God has something more for me in a life partnership, and he tries to explore that, and he goes, we navigate with him the awkward interactions of first dates and speed
yeah,
dating, and
yeah, that's great.
the reality of romance in the 21st century, especially for someone who's sort of been guarded and has sort of never lived that, and now trying to sort of come into that. And I mean, in some ways, there's so much of me in that, because I sort of, the first woman that I ever dated was my wife at 23. It's the first woman I kissed and been with, So
Yeah,
there's so much of
yeah,
me in that character, but I'm sort of doing it in a universe that I can sort of own here in Brighton Beach and Coney Island, where, I live in New York City. So that's sort of, and it's, my parents were missionaries to Russia when I was a kid. So I sort of have a lot of, affinity to that part of the world.
yeah,
I think my deepest fear when I was younger was that my dad was going to get taken by on one of his trips to Russia, because it was sort of illegal to do any sort of Christian proselytizing work, as it still is. Was that my dad was going to get taken, and I'm actually working on a feature film that's more realist. It's more like Euphoria meets The Lives of Others meets Good Will Hunting. About, I think I mentioned this, about a kid who has a drug addiction and spirals out of control. Um, but I want to wrestle in the meantime. I really want to wrestle with comedy. The other film that I have is this true story, and this is another short about this guy, this missionary, this engineer turned missionary, who's a unregistered Baptist missionary who travels to the northernmost part of Russia to an area called the Yamal Peninsula, because he takes the scripture, Matthew 24:14, literally, that says, preach the gospel to the ends of the world, or to the ends of the earth, and then the end will come. He goes to this place called the Yamal Peninsula, that literally means in Russia, the end of the land. He buys a treacle, which is a military-grade massive six-wheeler vehicle, to try and get to the Nenets, to try and get to the northernmost parts, which is where the Nenets indigenous tribe lives. And in both these stories, I actually have a documentary crew following them. So it'll sort of be like I, Tonya, where you have these like bits to camera, and then you tell the narrative story, and you use the bits of camera to sort of like play with subjectivity and objectivity and unreliable narrators. But then he goes and he meets this Nenets tribal leader, and he says, "Is there anyone that lives more north than you?" And the leader is like, "No, I'm the last one." And so I'm going to come back. He says, "I'm going to come back tomorrow, and I want to tell you something." And he goes back to maybe his hotel room and prepares his like last meal, puts on his finest suit, and then nothing happens, you know. And then and in the end, he meets that Orthodox priest that I had in the this is a triptych of stories. But the Orthodox priest he meets in his hotel room after he sort of preached the gospel to the Nenets tribal leader, and nothing happens. It's sort of just, you know, the sky opens and it's almost like Aurora Borealis, which you get if you're that far north, but it's just a natural occurrence, you know?
Yeah.
And he's sort of let down, and he, just outside, just as he's come back, Ivan walks past, and he's like, he sees this dejected guy. And he's like, "Oh, you know, I see you have a Iftus sticker on your car. Are you a Christian as well?" And Pavel says, "Yes, I've been here. I've been trying to preach the gospel, and you know, to these godless tribes." And Ivan's like, "I've been here, you know, for 5 years, just living amongst these people. I've never really told them the gospel, but I've lived it. You know, I've sort of like, you know, just been with them." And it's sort of that St. Francis of Assisi thing. If necessary, use the gospel. Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. And it's trying to sort of get to the heart of, I think, what faith is, which is it's not militant nationalism, which I think you get in the US. It's actually community and presence and being with people, and in some ways it's also not about the supernatural. It's about the very natural relational things, and using comedy to sort of explore that has been really fun and eye-opening that it's sort of possible, you know.
That's cool. Well, I had this question for later on, but I feel like it's on topic now. But kind of like, if someone, let's say someone was listening to this podcast, producer or financier or whatever, was like, "Oh, I want to finance your next project, whatever it is, your next feature." Do you know which project it is you would move forward? If there was like, all the money's here, I'm going to provide all the money, you just make it. Is there a project that comes to mind first?
Yeah, it'll probably be this one called Iconoclast, about the 17-year-old missionary kid who moves from the outskirts of Johannesburg to the outskirts of Moscow, and soon upon arriving, his father is taken by state authorities, and this kid's life spirals out of control, and he has to go to rehab, like group therapy, where he meets an Orthodox priest, and these two clash, and they're just ideologically very opposed. Because also in Russia, the Orthodox Church is sort of, I think by a lot of people, is sort of seen as corrupt, but there's still sort of a vestige, I think, of real Christ-filled Orthodox people there that have sort of not been commanded by the government. And I'm writing a story about a kid in one of those priests and their relationship. This guy that becomes a proxy father to this kid, while his father is imprisoned. And I think that's the first one,
awesome.
because in some ways it's the most I want to say it's sort of semi-autobiographical. It's the closest to me. There's still a lot of work that sort of needs to be done with it, but I think it's that one. There is another film called Foreign Animals that's set here in Brighton Beach, Coney Island, Ukrainian immigrant family. That's sort of like the town meets Little Odessa meets Lahane. It's about these kids from different parts of the sort of the Slavic world that rob from undocumented immigrants because they can get away with it. Um, and then it's a story of one of these kids and his father and their sort of like struggle. So many of my stories are father-son stories. And I'm just sort of exploring the prismatic elements, I guess, of those stories.
That's great.
That would be another one. I think it's just whenever the season, I've pushed that one so hard over the last while, and it just doesn't feel like it's sort of the right time for it. So I'm also, honestly, if I'm very honest with you, I'm like in a season of surrender, because I think there are these things that I've like really wanted to see come to light, and they haven't yet, and I'm sort of going, God, I'm preparing a lot of things, and I would just want to offer them up for when the season is ready. So literally this morning, I was working on a film called The Badger. That's also sort of US based, sort of like Nomadland meets Monster meets Into the Wild, of a South African farmer who moves to Wyoming after a tragic event happened in South Africa to her family. And she has a unique skill to sort of understand and read weather patterns. But she's looking for someone to sponsor her green card, but no one's willing, because she has all these anger outbursts that no one can understand where it's coming from. And then finally a rancher says, I'll take you on, but you have to go to therapy. And there's a thing called constellation therapy that's done at this group therapy. And we learned that her husband and kids were killed on a farm, and that she ended up killing the killer. And
Wow.
the film is about trying to find redemption, trying to find the mother of the person that she's killed. And it's very true to sort of a lot of things that are happening in South Africa at the moment, but that's another one. And there's so many others, and just trying to find the season, try to meet the season with a bunch of ideas and see which one is right for the moment.
That's cool. You mentioned a season of surrender, and I feel like, for filmmaking especially, it just takes so much to do like a whole full feature, and you kind of need team, you need an army, you need money. Well, is there any like practical things you do to deal with that sense, like choosing to surrender? Because I know, like, we can feel that God is calling us maybe to something, but then it's like, well, I'm willing, Lord, but what do I do next? Is there any? Do you ever feel like the Lord's calling you to any direction, or is there just like a little, I just like get on my face and say I surrender? Or like, what is there any practical things that you kind of do in that time?
Yeah, honestly, and this is the thing to say, I think surrender is not just a state of being. Yes, it is, but it's sort of easy to say, you just do it. It's just sort of a state of being. But I think it's really, I think it's stopping a fight in a certain direction, and sort of either changing direction or just going, I'm actually not going to fight. So for instance, for Foreign Animals, I've sort of really fought. I've been trying pretty hard to get it in front of people, and having come very, very close twice on like money closing for it. Now I'm just going, I'm not fighting on that. If there's a conversation that just springs up randomly, I'll have the conversation, but I'm not going after it. Meaning I'm not putting my emotions, I'm not attaching my emotions to anything related to that film. And I'm not going hard after pursuing any avenues for it. Again, if I get an email in, what are you working on? Oh, I'll send it, but I'm not hitting people up. So
Yeah.
that's sort of practically, I think, what that looks like for me in that. And I think I've become better at trusting God, honestly, just in the career side is one thing for sure, but I'm like, I've got deeper, no, not deep, I've got bigger things to deal with, like I've got like back problems at the moment, and that's a real trusting God for, because that I feel constantly, and it's uh and on, I think on that level, the other things I'm like much more much more open to however they work out. On this one, on my back, I'm just really honestly
Totally.
desperate.
Yeah.
Um, so
I know it's funny how that the physical so quickly puts everything into perspective, you know,
yeah,
when
yeah, it
yeah.
overrides all other things.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, I want to just ask a few kind of quick little, lightning round, if you will. Not that it has to be quick, but um, just on the faith side is interesting to me. I don't feel like we get to hear people talk about it much, but are there any like practices or disciplines, routines, kind of spiritual practices that like you've kind of are generally a regular part of your life that you've have found fruitful?
Um, I think that the biggest thing that I know adds value, and in some ways is the hardest thing to do, I think, just because um the 21st century is just so noisy, um, is being still. And it's like, it's sort of the cliche, because it's not a particular action. It's like the absence of actions. And but last night I was just like, we're currently upstate, and I was just putting, I have a tendency to live with my headphones in my ear. And that's why
Same.
I didn't have my headphones working when we started this call. But last night as I was sitting, I was just making the fire, and I was like, this is so good for my soul, just sitting here and listening to the fire. And so after the kids were to bed and my wife was already in bed, and I was like, I don't do this enough, but I really feel spoken to. I
Mm,
really feel like I know my place in the here and now, but also I know my place just in my value. Um, so for me, I think that's the biggest thing, and it's the biggest, uh, sort of the biggest value added to my life, and in some ways it's the hardest to do, because the distraction, sort of the cocaine of our society, is so readily available, and it tastes so good, being busy, being validated through social media. It's just such a strong drug,
yeah.
and I'm so guilty of partaking.
Same.
um, but and I know, when I think of like what sort of represents, I was going to say it, and again it's sort of like very uh conspiracy theorist of me, but if I think of what represents sort of antichristness, antichrist's likeness, I think it's
Mm,
sort of social media and algorithms. It's just such a, it's it's cognitive scientists talk about worship as being attention, what you give attention to. And
mm,
our devices, social media algorithms, are really just stealing attention. They're things that steal attention. So
yeah.
they steal worship. And then if I go deeper on sort of what artificial intelligence is, and that it's these new things, they're large language models, so they're words manipulated by numbers. The
Yeah.
original word is Christ. John 1 sort of speaks about how reality and life came into being, and how life is sustained through the original word Christ. Um, and we're sort of living in a world where truth is becoming very, what is truth? I don't even know these days on YouTube what videos are real and not. And so
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence for me is a big thing. Um, it's not like something to be shunned, but I think it is something to have a very tempered relationship with.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and maybe the future might even say, maybe the future may suggest otherwise. As in, maybe the future suggests like no relationship with artificial intelligence. I don't
Yeah.
know. But
Yeah,
certainly where we are now, I think just be careful, you know. Anyway, I don't want to get into a
absolutely.
big rant on that.
No, that's good. I'm there with you. I've kind of like have certain rules on social media for myself, or like I try to pretty much only do like I'm like even just keeping it to my computer and not on my phone when it's
Right.
that so it's not reactionary has been like a helpful thing. But I mean, it's once you start flipping on those vertical videos, all of a sudden an hour has gone by.
Exactly
You know.
that. Exactly that.
I wanted to ask you too. This is kind of about like ambition. So I come from an ambitious family. I'm definitely an ambitious person. I think a lot of people kind of are to some degree. But I also think as a believer, there's been this battle of like humility and to, there seems to be this tension. I think a lot of believers are kind of apprehensive or suspicious of their own ambition.
Mm.
Um, and I'm not so sure. I think sometimes it's hurting people, and then sometimes I think it's good. I think there could be different phases in life. But what's your relationship to ambition like? Is it something you're keeping in check, or is it something you feel like God is empowering you to kind of push forward on?
I'll put it this way. I think it's really important. Well, not really important. I think it's just how can I articulate it? We can have two engines that drive us. I really think ambition is not a great engine to drive us. But I think curiosity is an incredible driver because I think that in some ways is God given. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. But my feeling is that ambition is not I don't know if that's a sort of a God given driver because it's sort of outward focused. It's like unsustainable because you need to do better than you did before. You're fighting I mean, even when people say
It's like self.
it's very
Yeah.
self, like you're fighting yourself to be better than yourself. I'm like, oh, that sounds great. But actually, like, I don't feel like I create my best work when I'm doing that because I can't even undo the last project that I did. So why am I even trying? I'm not, but when it's out of curiosity, it's like, oh God, what did you show me in this thing that I need to go and dig up um and why am I fascinated by? I'm like immensely fascinated by rocks and archaeology. And then recently, and I didn't even know where that came from. And then recently, I discovered there, uh, I don't know how you say it, Herculaneum scrolls, Herculean scrolls, from Pompeii. That was these texts that are charcoal blocks now that they realized were basically stored in that was part of a library in Pompeii that Mount Vesuvius destroyed when it erupted. But there's ancient texts buried in this that like, oh wow, so okay, rocks, and I couldn't even tie these things together. But now they've now been able to use scans, X-rays, and I think different technologies to open and virtually unwrap these ancient texts that we had access to for, I don't know, hundreds of years, but we couldn't open because they would just break and fall apart. Now we can scan them and we can learn what's in these texts. Some of these texts are like ancient, like Leviticus. They discovered Leviticus, like manuscripts of Leviticus in this thing. I'm like, oh, that's so interesting. And I've got no ambitious, like I've got no, I don't know why that is interesting in like an ambitious sense. Like I don't know who's going to care about that, but there's something there that I want to go unlock and I want to go make something out of it, you know? I think I realize when I start getting unhealthy, when it's like, oh, this thing is going to do a lot of things for me. It becomes
Mm.
outcome based, a project. Like, oh, what is this thing going to unlock door wise, opportunity wise? And I get that there's a reality to that, but I think I've been more healthy when it's just the project itself. Like, what does the project itself mean to me? How does it speak to me? Why do I want to bring that out into the world? I think if my answer is because it's going to do this for me and that for me, or as opposed to, sorry, if it's like, you know what, I think someone's going to find something in the story that I found and connect with it emotionally like I connected with it, or just out of an interest, then I feel like it's sort of a better. I'm not trying to vilify ambition for people that are driven by it. Just doesn't work for me. It's just not. It's not
Yeah.
like some people are very driven by competition. I'm not. Like, if you i- i- if I have to do something that I'm competing against a friend with, I actually hate it because it puts a strain on our relationship. It's not good for us.
Yeah.
I'm better just operating out of curiosity. I'm not saying like, oh, I'm the most curious person, but it's just the driver. If I identify the driver being curiosity, and I think who was it? It may have been like John Mark Comer or John Tyson who said, "Be driven by curiosity and not ambition." I was like, "Whoa, yes, there's a truth to that for me."
That's good. That's very good. So getting into our last questions here, this is kind of like jumping back some, but is there a time you feel like it could be the first time you felt like God was like real to you or that he rescued you? For me, it's like, oh, I think more of like a, a time of where he like later on in life. I've always felt like I've known him most of my life. I kind of grew up like a pastor's kid similarly as well. But I feel like there was a time when he became real to me, where it was like he's not just like a good God, but he is a good God who rescued me. Is there a time for you that comes to mind that you've experienced with him, whether it be later in life or early in life, that he just felt real?
Many times, honestly, like it's I think that's the one thing that sometimes break me when um when I think he gets such a bad God gets such a bad rap um
Yeah.
because it's so on surface things that I think if you have an encounter with God, it's like, man, it's like he restores everything, and I was just like, sometimes when I just like need to be reminded of the things that God has done for me. I watch these videos on on YouTube, trying to think of what they're called. They're like these testimony videos of like drug addicts. And
I think I
and
maybe watched the same videos.
yeah, there's a couple of them, and they always they always end with who does Jesus mean to you? Who is Jesus to you? Every time I see those, I'm like, they just speak to me so much because I don't have the same experience as those people have had with drug or alcohol or addiction, but I have my own things, like I have my own subjective lows, like, and we all have rock bottoms, and it may look very different, but it's things that we can't get out. It's situations that we can't get out of ourselves, by no sheer power of our will. And I think those are the moments where God comes and sort of like reveals himself and shows you who you are in light of him. And one was in 2018, like I said, about when I had that burnout. And then 2 years later, during sort of a similar period, like uh, career, like a fraught moment in my career. Um, and it's always in the depths of despair. It's like,
Yeah.
it's always there. It's always there's no way out, that God comes and restores you, So those moments have meant a lot to me, and I can't remember who said it or whether it's, I don't know, whether it's even just a thought of mine, but I feel like I've heard it said that you can either um, have these moments, an encounter with who God is in these intense moments of suffering, um, or you can surrender um, every day. Every day, come and meet him so that you don't have to get to that place. It's either like the small everyday moments of surrender and prayer, um, and um, and meditation, or you walk away from that at your own peril, and you will meet a moment where you get to the end of yourself. And I always think there's three ways. There's three paths there. It's either you choose to just end it. You try to do it in your own strength, and maybe it'll help for a season, but you will get there again and again, or you surrender to who God is. And I have just personally find that surrendering to who God is time and time again, that's just, that fills my cup, you know? But yeah, and that I can, and it's, I don't want to say it sucks, but there's sort of no rational argument. There's no apologetics argument that I
Yeah.
can sort of give to why I think God is real, or it's just when you have nothing, God fills that. And I wish more people turn to God, because I know there's a lot of people that operate out of the nothingness, you know, increasingly so. I think we hear it so often, like we live in a meaningless, there's a meaning crisis, and young people are living in sort of a meaningless generation. I'm like, yeah, I think there's a reason for it. You know, God's not a factor of people's lives, and there's a hostility to it, which I understand. I get the cultural context that we live in, why that has happened, especially because the Western American evangelical church has been so messed up. So it's completely understandable. It's just a shame that so many people throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I think to a lot of people it would be life. And listening to those YouTube documentaries, I was like, man, if people listen to them, it could really save them. It could really, what I mean save them is like, I think a lot of people just go, oh, well, saved means, are you saving my soul to go to heaven? It's like, actually, no, you're saved from yourself here on earth in a way. Like, you are saved from your ego here on earth that's going to cripple you, that's going to destroy you, that's going to destroy your marriage. That's what you're saved from. God will reveal the rest to you. But first and foremost, I think to be saved is something for this life. It's,
Amen.
you know, I think it's like the kingdom is the kingdom of the here and not yet, you know. I think God's working out his kingdom in the here and now. It's not just saved for, when we die. I think that's a very limited way of seeing what all that God has for us here in a way.
That's good. Well, that's great with that. Let me close. Can I actually, I wasn't planning this, can I just say a quick prayer to close us out on this?
Yeah, absolutely, man.
Yeah. Lord, I thank you for this time. I thank you for Salomon, Lord. I just pray a blessing over him and his family, his children, his wife, Lord, his relationships, Lord, what you call him to. I pray that you would empower him, Lord, that he could be diligent with where you lead him, but he could abandon the outcomes to you, Father. I pray that he could bring glory to you in the way that you would have it, Lord. And I just thank you for it. I pray that you'd heal his back. By your stripes we are healed, Father. And I just pray for just in that surrender time, Lord, that could just be an overflowing of your presence and your calling, Lord. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. Awesome.
Appreciate it, Nathan.
Thanks, man.